Dr. Mari, how does this all begin? Can you explain the process of addiction?
Well, I think the important initial step is to freely choose to use an addictive agent to bring you pleasure. And then what happens is if you begin to go more frequently into using the substance, it can become abusive, and even to the point where you begin to feel not so much self-possessed, but at some level possessed by what it is you're addicted to. So it's definitely a downward spiral.
It sounds as if you're saying that free choice plays a role in addiction.
Yes, it's true. A person does have the ability to follow a path toward what is good, what is true, what is beautiful, that leads to life, or to choose a path that is towards the false, the bad, and the ugly, which usually leads to destruction.
To some degree, is a person morally responsible for addiction?
Well, addiction is a self-inflicted disease. So let's say your first line of cocaine is a free choice. So it's important to recognize that. Of course, there would be cases where an addiction could be forced. For example, in a satanic cult, children might be forced to begin an addiction habit. So for the most part, of course, ordinarily, it is certainly self-inflicted.
What about the idea of addiction being a disease? Is it a disease?
Well, certainly long-term abuse has important consequences. There is medical evidence that long-term abuse does have serious disease-like consequences.
It sounds as if addiction is the addict is both the perpetrator and the victim. Could you say a victim of his own wrongdoing?
Yes, actually, that is a good way of putting it, because in the final analysis, addiction is self-defeating.
What role does genetics play in addiction?
Well, I think, for example, if you look at the case of alcoholism, there are certain ethnic and racial differences in different parts of the world. For example, human genes and the design of human kidneys actually can adapt to the availability of water for survival in a particular climate. But it does not mean that to initiate the addiction cycle can't be a free choice.
There's a lot of talk about the addictive personality. What does this term mean?
Well, there is not just one addiction-prone personality. Actually, there are several propensities or predisposing factors for a person to become an addict.
Well then, what types of people are especially vulnerable to addiction?
Well, I think it could probably be clustered, I would say, into learning problems, psychological problems, religious problems, and family problems. Those are the most important predisposing factors. For example, in learning area, you would have a child who perhaps has academic difficulties or perhaps a disability, and he finds that he is actually getting involved in drugs because of, let's say, neighbors or rock music or just influences in the media that might start a problem. Psychologically, a person who's been deprived of attention, affection, and approval growing up can become an addict. You can also have someone who represses feelings that are related to a shock in life, such as sexual abuse. That is a predisposing factor. Growing up without proper moral values and a personal relationship with God can lead to addiction, as well as family factors such as growing up in a fatherless home because of separation or divorce, living with an addict, having an addict who's a parent, or even just being spoiled or permissively raised can lead to an addiction.
So what is it that these vulnerable people are longing for that makes them vulnerable to addiction?
They're looking for the gift of being desired, being loved in a Christ-like way, to receive the joys of being psychologically strengthened by love.
You mentioned earlier that free will plays a role, at least in the initial stages of addiction. Do normal people suffer from addiction?
Yes, it's possible for people without personal and family problems to be addicts.
So on a more philosophical level, why do human beings have this tendency towards addiction?
Well, I think that since we are created to be in paradise, to live in loving communion with our Father in heaven, certainly we're prone to, when we're in a situation where we taste the things of heaven, such as things that give us strength or that feel enlightening or that are glamorous in some way, those things can trap us, so we end up actually giving those things our adoration rather than God, who is due our adoration. And unfortunately, though, the net gain is pain, despair, psychological weakness, and actually that's the paradox of addictions.